In the 1980s, a series of horrific murders took place in Rostov-on-Don and the surrounding Rostov region. The victims were brutally murdered and their bodies were severely mutilated. They suffered multiple stab wounds, some had body parts bitten or consumed, while others had their internal organs removed. There were also signs of strangulation, and most had been sexually assaulted. Among the victims were young women and children. The youngest was a 7-year-old boy. On December 22, 1978, the body of a 9-year-old girl, Elena Zakotnova, was discovered under a footbridge in the Misidentified settlement on the bank of the Grushevka River. The girl had been suffocated and her eyes were covered with a scarf. Her backpack was later discovered downstream. Classmates revealed that the day before, Elena Zakotnova had left class early as she was in a hurry to go somewhere. An eyewitness, Gorenkova, reported seeing the girl before murder. She informed law enforcement that she had seen the girl at a bus stop in the evening. Standing next to her was a tall, well-dressed man wearing glasses and a top hat, speaking with her before they left together. Gorenkova provided the police with a detailed description of the man's appearance, leading to the creation of a sketch of the alleged suspect. The photo depicts a local teacher, Andrei Chikatilo, who had recently purchased an old house in the village of Medjevo, near where the girl's body was discovered. The police arrested Chikatilo and brought him to the station for questioning. During questioning, Chikatilo insisted that he had nothing to do with Elena Zakotnova's murder. He also claimed that he had been at home at the time of the girl's murder, a statement confirmed by his wife, who was the dormitory commandant at the same school where Chikatilo worked. Believing his alibi to be reliable, the police released Andrei Chikatilo. Meanwhile, investigators pursued other leads. They examined criminal archives and searched for individuals suspected or convicted of similar crimes. It was soon discovered that 25-year-old Alexander Kravchenko, previously convicted of the rape and murder of a minor, lived near the river where the girl's body was found. The police immediately arrested Kravchenko. During a search of his home, stolen items belonging to his neighbors were discovered in the attic. Kravchenko initially denied killing the girl, but after some time, he confessed to murdering Elena Zakotnova. As a result, the court sentenced him to death, the highest penalty in effect in the Soviet Union at the time. On September 3, 1981, the police received a report that the body of a naked girl had been discovered on the left bank of the Don River, 50 meters from the highway. When police officers arrived, they were met with a horrifying scene. The girl had been brutally beaten with a stick, and the bloodied weapon lay beside her. There were signs of strangulation on the victim's neck. Her mouth had been stuffed with dirt, and one of her breasts had been partially eaten. The victim was identified as 17-year-old boarding school student Larisa Tkachenko. The autopsy revealed that she had first been severely beaten with a stick and then strangled by hand. On June 12, 1982, 13-year-old Lyuba Biryuk vanished. Her mother had sent her to a neighboring village for groceries, but she never returned home. Her mutilated body was discovered in a forest strip along the Novocherkassk-Bagaevskaya highway. Her head had been hacked. She had been sustained more than 40 stab wounds to the neck, chest, and arms, and her eyes had been gouged out. On September 8, 1982, 19-year-old Irina Karabelnikova left home after a quarrel with her parents and was never seen again. Her body was discovered in the woods halfway between Rostov-on-Don and the Shakhnaya Railroad. On September 15, 1982, 16-year-old Sergei Kuzmin ran away from school due to bullying by his classmates. His body was discovered in a wooded area between the Kirpichny and Shakhty railroad stations. On December 11, 1982, 10-year-old Olga Stalmakenko left for music school but never returned home. Her body was discovered in a field on a state farm near Novoshakhtinsky. The killer had cut out the girl's heart with a knife. In July 1983, 13-year-old Irina Dunankova, a teenager with oligophrenia, went missing. Her body was discovered in Aviator Park. Another woman, 24-year-old mother of two, Lyudmila Kashuba, went missing in July. Her mutilated body was discovered in a wooded area between Kirpichny and Shakti stations. On September 4, 1983, the naked body of another girl was discovered on the outskirts of Novoshaktinsky, but the police were unable to identify her. The police were now certain that all the murders bore the same signature. The killer first sexually assaulted the victim, then strangled her, stabbed her multiple times in the body and genitals, and, in some cases, cut open her internal organs. It was clear to them that a brutal serial killer was operating in the region, but neither the police nor the media revealed or reported it, as strict Soviet censorship made it impossible to publicly acknowledge the presence of a serial killer in the country. The prosecutor's office of the Rostov region established an investigative and operational group tasked with solving the murders. The investigative team suspected that the murderer might be mentally ill and pursued this theory. 100 kilometers from Rostov, in the town of Zverevo, there was a psychoneurological boarding school. Lacking any real leads, the Soviet police began accusing its patients of murdering children and women. This investigation was unofficially dubbed the Case of the Fools. Soon after, a 20-year-old patient of the institution, Valery Shaburov, who had been diagnosed with oligophrenia, was arrested. During interrogation, he admitted to murdering children and women and named an accomplice who was also a patient at the psychiatric hospital. He also provided investigators with the names of several other accomplices. All the detainees wrote confessions and pleaded guilty, even to murders committed after their arrest. To make this version more plausible, the Soviet police brought in new patients from the boarding school, whom they believed were continuing the series of murders to deflect suspicion from their already arrested accomplices. The accused consistently confused details in their testimony, failed to name the exact crime locations, and were unable to describe the victims' appearances. They periodically recanted their confessions, claiming that the police had forced them to sign false statements under pressure from fellow inmates. Ultimately, the investigation, unofficially known as the Case of the Fools, collapsed due to gross misconduct by law enforcement. A criminal case was opened against them, but after several months, it was closed due to a lack of evidence. Meanwhile, the murders continued. A serial killer and sexual sadist who preyed on women and children was still active in Rostov and the Rostov region. The case was escalated to the highest levels of authority. The Central Committee of the Communist Party took control of the murder investigation and launched one of the largest operations in Soviet history to catch the serial killer. The special operation was named Forest Strip because the mutilated bodies of the victims were found in forest strips and woodlands. Isaac Ostoyev oversaw the operation while Viktor Burakov led the special task force. Shortly after the launch of Forest Strip on October 27, 1983, the mutilated body of 19-year-old Vera Shevkun, with both breasts removed, was discovered in a forest belt near Shakti. On December 27th, the body of Sergei Markov was discovered with approximately 70 stab wounds and genital mutilation. Investigators found Group 4 human biological material on his body. On January 9, 1984, the body of 17-year-old Natalia Shalopanina was discovered in Aviator Park with 27 stab wounds. On February 21st, 44-year-old Marta Ryabenko became one of the serial killer's victims. Her body was found in Aviator Park. Both her breasts had been mutilated and her uterus was removed. Marta Ryabenko was the oldest of the serial killer's known victims at that time. The investigation of the Forest Lane case became complicated. To create a psychological profile of the killer, the task force consulted psychiatrist Alexander Bukhanovsky. He described the maniac as calm, intelligent, and family-oriented, who could be heterosexual or impotent. According to his conclusion, the maniac used a knife as a substitute for a sexual organ and took his victim's intimate parts as trophies. Although the psychiatrist's profile was detailed, it did not significantly aid the investigation. However, the investigation team had enough evidence to identify the perpetrator's signature. The investigation concluded that the murders were sexually motivated. motivated. However, out of 23 victims, only 4 boys had been directly raped. In the cases of the girls and women, the killer's biological material was found in only 1 of the 18 victims. The investigation was hindered by the lack of witnesses. The investigation proceeded using the process of elimination. First, they needed to determine several key directions of the serial killer's movements. The perpetrator could be identified based on psychological traits, physical characteristics, or professional background. He frequently traveled by electric train on the Novoshaktinsky-Shakht-Rostov route, as the highest number of bodies had been found along that line. It was possible that he was a railroad employee. Bodies were also discovered near highways, so drivers and motorists were considered suspects as well. The professionalism with which the maniac tortured his victims raised suspicions that he might have been a professional doctor, possibly driven by sinister scientific motives. The criminal's professional cover-up led investigators to suspect that the maniac might have been a police officer. The investigation mapped the locations where the bodies were discovered and used this information to try to determine the serial killer's travel routes and to uncover where he lived, worked, and whom he associated with. It became clear that the maniac held a job that required frequent train travel. According to the route map created by the investigation, all roads led to the Rostov Centralny station and further along the railroad line to Novoshaktinsky. Police officers and volunteers monitored all public places where the criminal might appear. They stopped numerous individuals, checked their documents, and followed and contacted suspicious persons, but to no avail. At the end of 1986, the investigation launched a new operation called Monoki. They attempted to catch the criminals using live baiting, with policewomen posing as beggars, drunks, or sex workers. Similar operations had been carried out in crowded areas such as airports and train stations. However, this method of capturing the maniac was unsuccessful. Many murders also occurred near highways, and it was suggested that the serial killer could have been a truck or bus driver. As part of the investigation, blood type tests were taken from 165,000 drivers, but they yielded no results. It was horrific, but the Soviet police also used teenagers as live bait, as homosexuals were among the main groups of suspects. The file for the special operation Forest Strip gradually grew, covering more than 300,000 individuals. During the investigation of these murders, 1 through 62 other criminal cases, including sexual offense cases, were opened in parallel, but the person sought by the investigation was nowhere to be found. In late August 1984, while on duty at a railway station, 2 policemen, Zanosovsky and Akhmatkanov, noticed a man wandering around the hall. He approached young girls and tried to make contact with them. They found the man's actions suspicious and started following him. When the stranger could do nothing at the station and all the girls avoided talking to him, he left the station. The police silently followed him. The unknown man changed multiple forms of transport, walked through many streets and parks, but did not engage with anyone, so he returned to the train station and sat on a bench in the waiting room. Suddenly, the policeman saw a girl sitting next to him. The stranger started talking to her. After a while, the girl put her head on the man's lap. The police believed that the unknown man's appearance and behavior matched those of the wanted serial killer and decided to continue surveillance to see if he took the girl, who clearly seemed to be a sex worker. The police managed to overhear their conversation, during which the man arranged to meet her an hour later in the market area. The police met the strange man arriving for the meeting and arrested him. The arrested man turned out to be Andrei Chikatilo. During the search, Vaseline, ropes, wires, and a knife with bloodstains were found in his briefcase. The police assumed that these were all murder weapons. Andrei Chikatilo was sentenced to 3 months of pretrial detention and began to check his alibi for the moments of the crime. 2 police officers were placed in the cell with him to help establish his involvement in the murders. However, in their conversation, Chikatilo did not say anything suspicious that would confirm his involvement in the murders. Only one of his questions was strange. He wondered whether it was possible for the investigation to establish the identity of the maniac by traces of blood and biological material. By that time, the investigation already had the results of human biological material found in the victims. Forensic experts and criminalists results, which showed that the serial killer had a fourth blood type. When Chikatilo's blood type was checked, it turned out that he had type 2. So the police released Andrei Chikatilo from custody. Since 1986, the serial killer suddenly stopped killing, and there was silence. However, starting in 1987, he resumed his series of gruesome murders. The operational group discovered the body of an unknown woman near the town of Krasny Sulin. The nature of the murder left no doubt that the Rostov maniac had returned. On July 31, 1987, the body of 12-year-old Ivan Bilovetsky was found. He had suffered multiple stab wounds, and his mouth was stuffed with earth. On May 17, 1988, the body of a 9-year-old boy, Alexei Voronko, was found in a forest near Ilovaisk. His genitals had been cut off and his stomach had been cut open. On April 11, 1989, the body of 15-year-old Yevgeny Muratov was found in the woods near the Leskos Railroad. The boy had been tied up with a rope, his tongue had been cut off, and his stomach had been cut open. On March 9, 1989, the dismembered body of 16-year-old Tatiana Rizhova was found in a sewage well. Her limbs and head had been severed, and the severed body parts were wrapped individually in newspapers. On July 14, 1989, 8-year-old Alexander Diakonov disappeared from his yard. His body was found in the woods near the railroad station with numerous stab wounds and cut genitalia. On September 1, 1989, the body of Yelena Varga, an 18-year-old student and mother of a 2-year-old child, was found in the woods near the Krasnoznamenka railway station. She had both breasts and cheeks cut off and her uterus removed. On August 28, 1989, 10-year-old Alexei Kobatov disappeared without a trace. The police were unable to find any trace of him. On July 28, 1990, 13-year-old Viktor Petrov disappeared from Rostov Station, where he was with his mother. He went to drink water and did not return. His mutilated body was found in the Rostov Botanical Garden. On August 17, 1990, in the reeds near the beach in Novocherkassk, the police found the body of an 11-year-old boy, Ivan Fomin. The nature of the murder was the same. The body had multiple wounds, and the genitals had been cut. The boy had gray hair tangled in the fingers of his right hand. The horrible list of murdered people grew day by day, and it seemed that no one and nothing could stop the brutal serial killer. With his horrific actions, it seemed as though he was mocking the investigation, making it clear that he would never be caught. The police had constant control over the railroad. The larger stations were controlled by uniformed officers, while the smaller stations were controlled by agents in civilian clothes. The investigation believed that where there were uniformed police officers, the maniac would not risk committing a crime and would choose a smaller station to look for his next victim. On November 6, 1990, Sergeant Igor Rybakov was on duty at the Leskos railway station. He saw a well-dressed man coming out of the forest near the railway station. The stranger seemed very suspicious to him, as people mostly went to the woods for mushrooms, but this man, unlike them, was not dressed appropriately. He stopped the stranger, introduced himself as a police sergeant, and asked to see his ID. The unknown man turned out to be Andrei Chikatilo. Rybakov wrote down his name and surname, after which he let the man go. On November 13th, the body of 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik was found in the woods near the railway branch of the Leskos. Numerous stab wounds were found on her body, along with cuts on her tongue and both breasts. Kostoev, head of the investigation, believed that because the railway station was controlled by the police, the perpetrator could not have gone unnoticed. Whoever was on duty at the station that day must have seen the serial killer. This is how Sergeant Rybakov's report ended up on Kostoev's desk, where he read the name Andrei Chikatilo, which he already knew. In re-examining the case file, investigators found that Chikatilo had been repeatedly prosecuted in recent years in connection with serial murders. Witnesses also described a man who resembled Chikatilo as being involved in the murder of 16-year-old Viktor Tishenko, whose body had been found a few days earlier near the same location where Svetlana Korostik's body had been discovered. The day before the murder, Viktor had bought tickets at the train station. The cashier remembered not only the boy, but also the man with high glasses standing behind him in line. When questioned again, the cashier recalled that her daughter had mentioned several times the strange man whom she regularly saw on the elektrichka. According to her, one day, the girl and her friend witnessed an unusual scene. When the man approached the teenager, he introduced himself as an acquaintance of his mother and asked him to get off together at the next station. However, the boy ignored him, jumped out of the carriage, and disappeared into the crowd. Investigators contacted the personnel department of Chikatilo's former service to find out whether he had been on a business trip to Uzbekistan in the summer of 1984 or to Moscow in the summer of 1985. Not far from Tashkent and near Moscow's Domodedovo airport, the bodies of 2 women and a girl had been found with injuries similar to those on the bodies in Rostov. It turned out that Andrei Chikatilo had been in these regions at the same time as the murders occurred. Thus, the investigation had no doubt that the serial killer was Andrei Chikatilo. Despite this, the investigators decided not to arrest him immediately. They chose to keep an eye on him, hoping he might attempt another murder so they could arrest him in the act, making the investigation easier. During surveillance, the police saw Chikatilo attempting to engage with children and young women, although he did not take any active steps. Once, during another surveillance operation, Chikatilo was nearly hit by a car right in front of the police. The investigation had been searching for Chikatilo for several years, and it was too dangerous to risk his life in such an unforeseen situation. Therefore, the investigators decided to arrest him. On November 20th, Chikatilo left work earlier than usual and went to the hospital because of an injury to his finger, which was painful. He returned home from the hospital, took a 3-liter can, and went to a beer store. He was arrested by the police as he was leaving the store. During a search of his apartment, the police found 23 kitchen knives, a hammer, a bag containing rope, a knife, and Vaseline. Scratches were found on Chikatilo's face, and there were injuries to his index finger during medical examination. A forensic expert later determined that the scratches were caused by human fingernails, and the finger injury was the result of a human bite. Re-examination revealed that Chikatilo had the 4th blood type. It turned out that the experts had made a mistake in checking his blood type during the previous arrest. To cover up this mistake or negligence, the police spread a rumor called on-paradoxical separation, which suggested that a person's blood type and biological material could be different. Despite all this, the evidence for the investigation was not enough to formally charge Chikatilo. The investigators had only 10 days to get a confession from him. Kostoyev interrogated the suspect for several hours, but Chikatilo stubbornly denied his involvement in the murders. On the 9th day of the interrogation, investigator Kostoyev decided to focus on Chikatilo's mental state and, using this approach, attempted to make him confess. During the conversation, the investigator told Chikatilo that if he proved he was mentally ill at the time of the murders, he would be cured and the death penalty would be avoided. Kostoyev's trick worked. Chikatilo liked the idea of being mentally ill and agreed to see a psychiatrist. After a 3-hour conversation with psychiatrist Alexander Bukhanovsky, Andrei Chikatilo confessed to all the murders he had committed. According to Chikatilo's confession, he committed his first murder on December 22, 1978. Kostoyev was surprised, as this murder was not even in the investigation materials. Upon checking the information, Kostoyev discovered that a completely different person, Alexander Kravchenko, had been convicted and sentenced to death for this murder. The case materials revealed that a police officer had been in the same cell as the accused. This officer constantly used physical violence against Kravchenko and forced him to confess to the murder, which he did not commit. It turned out that while the agent was in the cell, Kravchenko confessed, but as soon as he was transferred to another location, he retracted his confession in court, stating that he had been coerced and tortured. It was later found that on the night when Elena Zakotnova was killed, Alexander Kravchenko had been drinking at home with his wife and a friend. However, The Soviet police were eager to find the murderer and rapist quickly. Therefore, the women were intimidated and forced to write testimonies stating that Kravchenko had gone out that evening to buy a drink and returned covered in blood. In February 1979, Kravchenko was sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, Elena Zakotnova's relatives demanded the harshest punishment. The case was returned 3 times for additional investigation, and finally, in July 1983, Alexander Kravchenko was sentenced to death. In Kravchenko's last letter, sent to the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet with a request for a pardon, he wrote, "The day will come when everyone will know that you executed an innocent man, and you will be ashamed. They tortured me into confessing to a murder I did not commit. They gave false testimony against me and forced me to confess to the murder." It was also suspicious that Chikatilo somehow managed to avoid murder charges. According to one theory, Chikatilo was unofficially a police agent or informant, keeping an eye on the investigation. When he realized that the investigation was escalating and that they could be closing in on him, he stopped the murders. As a result, there were periods when he did not kill anyone for several months. His last victim was 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik. Chikatilo took her to the forest near the Leskos railway station and attempted to have sex with her, but was unsuccessful, and Svetlana laughed at him. In response, he stabbed her with a knife, cut off part of her tongue, and swallowed it. He then severed both of her breasts and discarded them in the forest. Afterward, he returned to the train station where he came across Police Sergeant Igor Rybakov, who checked his identification and included his name in that day's report. Initially, Andrei Chikatilo was formally charged with the murder and rape of 35 people. He not only confessed to the aforementioned crimes, but also told investigators about 20 more murders that had not previously been connected to the series of murders he had committed. Investigators needed to obtain evidence for each crime before sending the case file to trial. They interrogated Chikatilo daily and visited the crime scenes with him. During one of the interrogations, he stated that he had dug a grave in the cemetery where he had buried one of the boys he had killed and showed the investigators the location. The body that was thought to be missing was found in the grave. This fact became one of the strongest pieces of evidence of Chikatilo's guilt, because without such detailed testimony, proving the charge would have been difficult. Chikatilo could only provide information to investigators that was already known to the public. Investigators needed precise details and circumstances of the murders, such as information about the injuries inflicted on the victims' bodies, which had not been publicly disclosed. Chikatilo's precise knowledge of these details proved his guilt. There were also witnesses who saw and identified Chikatilo at several murder scenes. When investigators asked Chikatilo why he cut up the organs of his victims, he replied that he ate them because he had heard that such an act increases a person's sexual potency. Chikatilo believed that he would be recognized as insane and avoid capital punishment. He underwent 3 forensic psychiatric examinations, 1 in Rostov and 2 in Moscow, at the Serbsky Institute of Forensic Psychiatry. The psychiatrists diagnosed him with organic personality disorder, the symptoms of which include unmotivated aggression and loss of the ability to control impulses and behavior. However, he was recognized as mentally healthy, and it was determined that Chikatilo was aware of the consequences of his horrific actions, but there was a question. If Chikatilo was mentally healthy, how can we explain the brutality with which he treated his victims? Psychiatrists argue that a person with such a disorder could not answer the question of why he would commit such horrible acts because he would lack a rational motive. Psychiatrists have tried to find an explanation for Chikatilo's horrible acts in his past, the environment he grew up in, and the influences of his childhood and adolescence on him. There are many rumors about Chikatilo's past which are almost impossible to verify. He was born on October 16, 1936, in the Kharkov region of Ukraine to Roman and Anna Chikatilo. He is said to have had congenital hydrocephalus, which causes headaches and visual deterioration. It is also claimed that his mother beat him constantly because Chikatilo suffered from urinary incontinence. With the outbreak of World War II, Chikatilo's father was drafted to the front. At this time, the village where Andrei and his mother lived was occupied by the Germans. It is said that Chikatilo witnessed the atrocities committed by the Nazis, including the shooting of children. According to one rumor, when German soldiers were shooting children, Chikatilo fell and hit his head on a rock. When he regained consciousness, he found himself lying in a pit full of corpses. It is also rumored that Chikatilo's mother was raped by German soldiers, as a result of which she became pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl. Chikatilo's story also mentions his older brother Stepan, who Chikatilo himself claimed was eaten by hungry villagers during the famine of 1933. However, there is no evidence to confirm Stepan's existence or death. It is assumed that this terrible story was invented by his parents to keep little Andrei from straying far from home. As for his younger years, Chikatilo recalled that one day his sister's friend visited. He was already a high school student, liked the girl very much, and tried to have sex with her, but nothing worked. The failure of his first attempt to have sex affected him so much that he later wrote in one of his notes that he would never have sexual relations with any woman except his wife. At the age of 26, Chikatilo met his future wife, Faina. A few years later, they had 2 children, a girl, Lyudmila, and a boy, Yuri. Later, Faina told the investigation that they had sex very rarely, about once every 2-3 months. For the last 6-7 years before Chikatilo's arrest, they had no sexual relations at all. The trial of Andrei Chikatilo began in April 1992. During the trial, he sat in a cage with bars specially built for him in the courtroom, where he was led through a tunnel from the basement. Because it was dangerous to lead him to the bench through the hall where the relatives of the murdered were seated, the famous court footage clearly shows how Chikatilo changed. When he realized that he could not escape the death penalty, his previously unremarkable, bespectacled, calm image disappeared, and he began to relentlessly demonstrate his inferiority. He took off his clothes in the courtroom and showed his genitals to those around him, swearing, joking, insulting everyone, shouting, and threatening. Nevertheless, Chikatilo managed to undergo a repeated psychiatric examination, although the results were the same as the previous ones. On October 15, 1992, Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 murders and sentenced to death. After sentencing, he was transferred to Novocherkassk prison. Before his execution, Chikatilo was very concerned about his health and took care of it as much as possible. He did not smoke, exercised, and ate well. In addition, he wrote numerous complaints against the judge and the investigation to the authorities and central newspapers, and also appealed to Russian President Boris Yeltsin with a request for a pardon. However, on January 4, 1994, his final petition was rejected. On the evening of February 14th of the same year, Chikatilo was taken to the place of execution in a UAZ car, accompanied by 2 guards, and shot.